I was never late, I didn't take long lunches, I didn't chase titles, and I never raised my voice, not even once in 8 years. My name's Lucas, I worked in finance, specifically contracts and projections, not the kind of role that gets you applause in town halls, but if you've ever seen a company fall apart because of a single misplaced clause, you'll understand why my job mattered. I wasn't in the spotlight, I didn't need to be, because if a deal didn't crash, it was probably because I caught the landmine buried on page 37. I knew which execs liked to skip the fine print, which partners tried to sneak in the equity clauses, which versions of which contracts had language no one ever reapproved. They didn't notice me, but I saw everything. The company liked to call itself a family. Integrity, innovation, inclusion. Those words were printed on every floor's wall in soft blue letters. But what they really meant was, sign it, ship it, don't slow us down. Darren, the VP of Ops, was a fast talker, ex-M&A guy, all charm and no patience. He didn't like questions. He liked closed deals and clean dashboards. And I was the guy who kept telling him, you can't sign that. There's a kill clause hidden in section C. He didn't like that. One time I flagged a clause that would have let a partner walk away 30 days in with zero penalty. Darren signed it anyway behind my back. The project crashed 3 weeks later. No one apologized. I still had to clean up the accounting mess. By year 5, they launched a new smart contract platform, AI-enabled, fast, integrated. Darren stood in front of the entire floor and called it a revolution in deal flow. I called it rushed. Guess who they asked to migrate the data? I didn't complain. I copied over 7 years worth of agreements, checked version histories, ran simulations to test clause recognition. And that's when I saw it's something off. Some of the contracts had been edited quietly, in particular executive level templates, custom clauses added in the footnotes. One line caught my eye. If the signee accrues a designated equity ratio over 3 consecutive quarters, they may activate a right to repurchase shares equivalent to contributed intangible assets. It sounded vague, but in finance speak, intangible assets can mean data systems processes, anything not listed but proven valuable. The clause, it was in my contract. Inserted during the last batch update Darren signed off on, back when he wanted to move fast and automate everything. The clause was valid, the logs confirmed it. And the irony, the smart contract system didn't flag it because I was the one who wrote its rules. A few days later I got the email. I was being realigned to a less critical role. No more access to live deals, no more clause reviews. Just spreadsheets, dead-end data, a polite way of saying sit quietly, fade out. I stared at the screen, didn't reply, didn't flinch. I opened my original contract, scrolled to Appendix D line 12, and I started running the numbers. They thought they buried me under boilerplate, but I'm the one who labeled every page, and I knew exactly when it would start printing money. I didn't storm into Darren's office, didn't forward the clause to legal, didn't copy HR. That's not how you handle a hidden trigger. You wait, you verify, and when the moment's right, you pull the string. I started with the numbers. The clause only activated if I held a designated equity ratio for 3 straight quarters. They thought they buried that condition under technical jargon, but I'd already cleared it. 2 years ago, the company couldn't meet payroll after a client defaulted. I stepped in and deferred 40% of my bonus, converted it into phantom shares under the employee liquidity program. Darren was so grateful, he said, "Lucas, you're a team player." He never asked what I did with the shares. Those phantom shares, they matured over time, quietly. Quarter after quarter, I let them sit, accumulating rights tax credits, equity offsets. 3 quarters passed, nobody noticed, except me. And now per the clause, I had the right not to sell, not to exit, but to buy. Buy specifically whatever portion of the company aligned with intangible assets I had contributed. It was vague on purpose. That clause wasn't about stock price. It was about ownership over what others couldn't see until they lost it. So I made a list, every internal system I'd built, the audit trails, the contract logging matrix, the clause variation tracker, the historical deal match engine. None of them were open sourced, none of them documented, all of them living in code I wrote, tied to my credentials, tied to logs I still controlled. They weren't property of the company because no one had ever formally transferred IP, not in writing, not with compensation, not in a traceable handover. In legal terms, I never gave them away. I backed up everything, encrypted it, stored it on a drive under my own legal name. Then I went silent, no Slack messages, no hallway chatter. Darren thought he won. He moved his intern into my old position, called it a fresh set of eyes. She accessed the systems, she found my scripts, she tried to use them. It worked for a week. Then things started failing. Not crashing, just resisting. Clauses reverted. Edits didn't save. The dashboards glitched subtly at first, then more. She sent in a ticket. The engineer looked at the backend and said, "It's not broken, it's locked." Darren didn't get it. He thought it was a bug. He pushed to override access. Legal asked me to weigh in quietly off record. I declined, politely, said I was focused on financial compliance, but that clause, it was starting to breathe. And Darren, he was too busy prepping for Q4 investor meetings to realize the walls were shifting. The systems weren't failing. They were deciding who still had permission. At night, I reviewed the clause again, not to check if it was enforceable. I'd already done that. I was reviewing the timing. My 3 quarters had cleared. The vesting schedule was done. All that was left was delivery. I scheduled a private meeting. Not with Darren, with 2 board members. Old school guys, respected process. I walked in with 1 folder, OneDrive. I showed them the clause. I showed them the logs. I showed them exactly how many systems would fall into legal limbo the moment I sent 1 email. And then I showed them what I wanted. Not revenge, just the right to execute what they had already signed. They thought the clause was buried, but they forgot who buried it with them and who still had the shovel. The board didn't say much in that meeting, just sat back, listened, flipped through the folder slowly. One of them, Harper, leaned forward, tapped the clause with a knuckle. "This real?" I nodded. He didn't look shocked, just impressed, in a way that made me wonder how many times he'd seen something like this before. I didn't ask for money. I didn't ask for severance. I asked for an asset review, a formal valuation of the intangible systems I had built, operated, and maintained, all tied to the clause they buried in my contract. Within 48 hours, legal requested a call. They tried to downplay the clause, called it ambiguous, unenforceable boilerplate noise. I didn't argue. I just emailed a copy of the audit trail showing when the clause was inserted, when it was approved, and by whom. Timestamped, immutable. Then I copied the email to the board. Silence. Meanwhile, the internal systems kept deteriorating. The contract dashboard went first, showed incorrect risk flags. Then the automated clause matching tool stopped syncing with the sales CRM. Then the legacy archive index dropped off the grid. Darren blamed the intern, said she misconfigured permissions. She didn't. The systems weren't broken. They were disengaging, 1 line at a time. Each tied to scripts I'd authored, each attached to credentials that hadn't been transferred legally or otherwise. They weren't shutting down. They were withdrawing consent. HR pinged me, asked if I'd be willing to consult. I said I'd consider it under new terms. They sent over a contract. It didn't include the clause. Cute. I sent back a redlined version with the clause restored, bolded, underlined. They didn't reply. Then came the investor's call. Darren presented the quarterlies, smiled, tried to explain the drop in contract velocity. But someone on the call had done their homework. They asked why the system migration had failed, why the clause index had reverted, why over $6 million in contracts were stored in pre-signature freeze, and why one mid-level finance employee now held a binding right to claim ownership over 11 proprietary systems. Darren blinked, froze, tried to pass it off, tried to lie. That's when the board cut the feed. The next day, I was asked to return, not as an employee, not as a consultant, as a buyer. The clause gave me the right to execute a buyout on the intangible assets I had contributed proportional to my equity ratio. I hired a third-party valuation firm. Quietly, they calculated my contribution to be worth just under 8.3% of the company's operating infrastructure. The board proposed a settlement. I declined. Instead, I made a counter-offer. I would purchase the entire infrastructure division at a pre-agreed multiplier under the clause they wrote, approved, and signed. They accepted. Darren didn't. He called me that night, asked if I was trying to humiliate him. I said no. If I wanted that, I would have let the systems fail during the investor call. What I wanted was simple. Ownership over what I built, on my terms, not theirs. That Friday, I walked back into the building, not through the employee entrance, through the executive wing. Signed the papers, transferred the systems, took control of the assets. The intern Rachel was assigned to my new team. I gave her access. This time the systems opened. They buried the clause. I just turned it into a deed. Monday morning, the news dropped. Company divests key infrastructure division to former employee. The board called it strategic repositioning. Darren didn't speak to the press. I didn't need to. The contract spoke for both of us. The infrastructure division, my division now, was lean, profitable, and essential. I renamed it quietly, moved it into a private entity, filed the trademarks, secured the IP, offered continuity services at market rate. The same systems they once took for granted now billed quarterly, per user, no discounts. They didn't negotiate. They couldn't. Every time they needed to roll a contract audit, a clause pull risk data, they came back to me. Not by choice, by design. Darren resigned 3 weeks later. The board called it a mutual decision. HR sent me a fruit basket. I sent it back, with a note that said, no hard feelings, just business. Rachel, my former replacement, stayed. She was smart, quick, didn't ask dumb questions. I let her in on everything, taught her what to look for, how to read clauses for what they don't say. She didn't thank me, she just got better. That's how I knew she'd last. One day I got a message from Darren, short, cold. Was it always about the clause? I didn't reply. Because it never was. It was about how people treat what they don't understand, how they underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who read everything, who listen, who remember. It was never about revenge. It was about recognition, not from others, from the system. And this system, I built it. A few months later, a new company reached out, said they admired what I'd done, asked if I'd consider a partnership. They offered a seat at the table. I told them I don't take seats anymore. I build the table. There's something satisfying about watching a signature go dry. The moment the ink hits the page and you realize it wasn't a battle, it wasn't a fight, it was a contract, and they lost because they didn't read it. But I did. They thought they buried me with a clause. But I buried them in silence. They wrote the rule. I just followed it all the way to the deed. Subscribe, leave a comment, and follow me to hear more incredible stories coming your way.